Hello, everyone, and welcome to this lecture on England in the early modern era. When we look at England in the early modern era, what we're looking at is the political situation that will lead to English colonization of the New World. The three dynasties that will rule over England during this period of time, from approximately 1485 all the way through American independence in 1783, will be the Tudor dynasty, who will reign from 1485 to 1603. Some of the things we will talk about under the Tudors are the English Reformation, the Spanish Armada, and New World exploration. We will then move on to the Stuart dynasty, who will reign over England from 1603 to 1714, and we'll look at the American colonial period, the English Civil War and interregnum period, the Restoration period, the Glorious Revolution, and finally the decline and fall of the House of Stuart. The final dynasty we will touch upon will be the House of Hanover, or the Hanoverian dynasty. They will technically rule over England from 1714 to 1901, but for the purposes of this course, we will only really talk about the first three kings of the Hanoverian dynasty: King George I, King George II, and most famously of the three, King George III. The House of Tudor, or the Tudor dynasty, will rule over England from 1485 to 1603. The Tudor dynasty will be a completely new royal family when they take the throne in 1485. The reason for them taking the throne was the fall and collapse of the Plantagenet dynasty, which will rule over England during most of its medieval period. The Plantagenet dynasty had broken up in the 1300s and early 1400s into two competing factions: the followers of the Yorkists, descendants of the Duke of York, and the Lancastrians, the ancestors of the Duke of Lancaster. Eventually what happens is that the Lancastrians lose this war, and the Yorkists take over. And Henry Tudor, who will found the Tudor dynasty, is a member of the Lancastrian dynasty. He is the step nephew of the last Lancastrian king, King Henry VI. And what will happen is that he will lead his armies in 1485 to retake England for the Lancastrian dynasty, and he will defeat the last of the Plantagenet kings of the Yorkist side. He will defeat King Richard III. He will become King Henry VII, and he will reign from 1485 to 1509. Now, even though this is a new dynasty, the Tudor dynasty, it will be technically a reforming of the Plantagenet family. He is, of course, the heir to the Lancastrian dynasty. He will marry Princess Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, who had been really the last uncontested York king before his brother took the throne as King Richard III. Now, as I said, he was a member of the Lancastrian family. I believe it was his grandmother who was married to a guy by the name of Edmund Tudor. Edmund Tudor the first. His father himself was Edmund Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, and that's why a lot of times you'll hear Henry VII referred to as Henry of Richmond. And his marriage to Elizabeth of York will reform the Plantagenet dynasty At the time of the war, they called them the War of the Roses because one side, their badge was the white rose, the other side was the red rose. And this is when you see the family recombined, they adopt what's called the Tudor rose or the pink rose. White plus red equals pink. And him and Elizabeth of York will have a fairly happy marriage. They will have a multitude of children. The heir to the throne is Arthur, the Prince of Wales. Now, they chose the name Arthur for a reason. As somebody who was trying to create a new dynasty and get away from all the Plantagenet baggage, he decided that from now on they would adopt new names. The Plantagenets were known for using the names Henry. I mean, obviously, he's the 7th Henry, so Henry has been used quite a bit. Edward is another name that they will use over and over again. There were technically 5 Edwards during the Plantagenet dynasty, or its prior eras in England's history. So he decided to go with Arthur. Arthur, of course, the mythical King Arthur, was supposed to give gravitas to this new dynasty. Unfortunately, Arthur will die. Arthur gets married and then somehow dies very early into his marriage. Most likely it was from tuberculosis or some other disease, but we don't know for sure. His eldest daughter will become the Queen of Scots. She will marry the King of the Scots, Scotland. His other daughter, Princess Mary, will become the Queen of France for a period of time. And of course, most famously, is his second eldest son, the oldest surviving son, who will become Henry VIII, who will succeed him as King of England. King Henry VIII will be born in June of 1491, his father being King Henry VII of England and his mother being his queen, Elizabeth of York. He will follow his father on the throne in 1509, and he will rule until 1547. So he will have a fairly long kingship. He will also have 6 wives, who we will explore in a minute because it has a lot to do with the English Reformation. His 6 wives are, of course, Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, Lady Anne Boleyn, Lady Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Lady Catherine Howard, and Lady Catherine Parr. And while he'll have many children, he only has 4 that are considered to be legitimate. 3 legitimate and 1 semi-legitimate. His heirs will be Mary I, who will rule as queen for a period of time. She is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth I, who will be Queen of England for a long period of time. She is the daughter of Lady Anne Boleyn. And Edward VI, who will be king before his 2 sisters for a short period of time. He is the son of Lady Jane Seymour. Now, Henry Fitzroy, the Duke of Richmond and Somerset, he is actually an illegitimate child who was fathered prior to the other 3, and his father loved him so much that he actually did legitimize him and made him a royal duke, which was very rare for medieval and early modern Europe. If you had a child out of wedlock, they were considered illegitimate. They were not as part of your inheritance. Henry Fitzroy he will be the Duke of Richmond and Somerset. He's not going to have he's not entitled to inherit the throne per se, but he is given his own lands and money. Now, Henry VIII will die in January of 1547. It will be right around 55 years old, and it will be on his father's birthday. So, happy birthday to his dad. He dies at 55 years old. The first of Henry VIII's queens is Catherine of Aragon. Now, as I said before, Catherine of Aragon is the daughter of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile and Leon. She is a very valuable spouse. Her father and mother at this point were extremely wealthy. England was not. England was a backwater country who had just fought a series of civil wars. They were also getting over the European wars called the 100 Years' Wars. And so England was really looking for some continental polishing. And Catherine of Aragon was that. Now, she was first married off to Arthur, the Prince of Wales. But their marriage only lasts for a few months. We are not sure whether they consummated the marriage or not. Likely they did. But when Arthur dies after a few months of marriage, King Henry VII has a problem. If he sends her back, he has to send the dowry that came with her, which made England a small fortune. So at first he thinks about marrying her to himself. His wife has recently died. She died in childbirth, giving birth to their last child. But then he decides to marry her off to his eldest surviving son, who would eventually become King Henry VIII. Now they're married for about 15 years, and she's a little older than Henry VIII, but they get along great. From what we can tell, for most of their marriage, they loved each other greatly. She has a child, an heir to the throne, Mary. But every time she gets pregnant again, the child either dies in utero, there's a miscarriage, or the child is born and then dies a few hours or a few days or a few weeks after being born. Well, eventually what happens is Catherine of Aragon gets into her 40s and she goes through menopause, meaning no more royal heirs for King Henry VIII. Well, what is there to do with this situation? Well, Henry begins to look around. There is this belief, and England does have a history of this up to this point, that female rulers do not end well. As a matter of fact, at this point, there had not been a true female ruler in England in its history. At least not one that stayed on the throne for any period of time. And knowing that he has one legitimate heir, Princess Mary, he has a decision to make. Does he make his illegitimate son not only legitimate and make him a royal duke, which he has already done, Henry Fitzroy? Does he draw up letters patent, making him his actual legitimate heir? Well, constitutionally, and I use that phrase loosely because England doesn't have a real constitution like we do, but constitutionally, Henry is talked out of this because they don't believe that the lords and aristocracy of England would accept it. So he needs a male heir, and he's going to begin to look for one of these at this period of time. At the same time he's beginning to look for another woman to conceive an heir with, Catherine of Aragon gets a new lady of waiting, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was from a very, very powerful family. The Boleyn family has had noble titles for as long as Henry's family, if not longer. She's probably more quote-unquote royal than Henry VIII. And she's also, she's much younger than Catherine of Aragon. She's a great age for birthing. And what Henry likes about her is her family produces many male heirs. Now, by the way, this is a time when they didn't understand how genetics work, and they believed that women determined the sex of the child, and you looked at her mother and saw how many boys she had, and that would decide how many boys you would have. Well, we now know that that has nothing to do with it. It's actually the male. The DNA within the sperm of a man is what produces the sex of a child, but they didn't know that. So he will begin courting her because she's beautiful, she's young, and she ends up pregnant. And Henry needs to make sure that they are together at the time this child is born, so that he will be a legitimate male heir. So he goes to his council and he begins to talk about putting aside his queen, Catherine of Aragon. But there's a problem. Not only will he have to possibly send that dowry back, but Catherine of Aragon's cousin, is Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, one of the most powerful people in the world. And in order to put aside his wife, he is going to have to get permission of one person, and that one person is the Pope. Well, Henry VIII is going to make a loose argument, a very loose argument. He's going to say that because Catherine of Aragon was married to his brother, and he's going to say that they consummated the marriage, that she was now technically his sister. Therefore, when they got married and had a child together, it was incest. That he essentially was forced by his father to marry his sister, and that his daughter Mary was born of incest. Now, today, of course, we know incest. That's not how incest works. But in royal families, technically, that is their definition. Once you marry into the family, you're then a full-blooded member of the family. Well, the Pope may have considered this, except Charles V put his finger on the scale and said, "You will not do this to my cousin. You will not do this." And so the Pope says, "No. We will not grant you a divorce. We will not grant you an annulment, and we will not grant you a divorce either." So what Henry VIII decides to do is, if he can't get rid of his wife through the church, he will get rid of the church. And what he creates here is called the Church of England. It is essentially nothing more than the Catholic Church, but instead of having a pope, he will be the Pope. He is going to be the supreme leader, I believe is the title he used. The supreme leader of the English Church. And the first thing he will do is grant himself a divorce. He will then marry Lady Anne Boleyn. She goes into labor. He runs up there and he counts 5, 5, 5, and 5. 10 fingers, 10 toes. But the one important digit he's looking for is missing. She gives birth to a daughter. And that daughter they will name Elizabeth in honor of his mother. Well, Anne Boleyn gets pregnant a couple more times. She doesn't ever carry a baby to term. And so now he's got a male heir, two female heirs, Elizabeth and Mary. He still doesn't have that male heir that he wants. And he begins to have an affair with one of her ladies-in-waiting, and surprise, surprise, this woman ends up pregnant. So he needs to do something to get rid of Anne Boleyn. The lady-in-waiting that he gets pregnant is Lady Jane Seymour, from another very powerful English family, the Seymour family. Jane Seymour is one of Anne Boleyn's ladies-in-waiting, and he realizes, again, here's another woman who her family has produced many, many male heirs. So he's very interested in getting married to her as quickly as possible. So he goes to his authorities, and he says, "I need a divorce from Anne Boleyn." And the members of his religious council and the members of his political council say, "No, you just can't do that. You can't keep marrying women until you get a male heir. You know, you're now married to Anne Boleyn. She has to be disappeared in the normal way. You know, you're married till death do you part. So what he decides to do is have her charged with trumped up charges of treason. He will say that Anne Boleyn has been having affairs with other men, and that the Princess Elizabeth is also an illegitimate child and not his. Problem with this is he looks just like her mother, Elizabeth. It's a good name, actually, because they look damn near closely the same. I mean, they are basically the same. They've got the same body frame. They have the same color hair. Basically, it is the same person. But he doesn't care. He wants her gone. Well, Anne Boleyn is put up on charges of treason. She is convicted in a very short trial. She's sentenced to die. The only thing that Henry does to really appease her, to help her, is that he calls for a swordsman to come from France that will make sure that she is executed quickly, versus having to be beheaded by an axe, which is highly unreliable. She's dead. He will now marry Jane Seymour. She goes into labor. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and there's that magic digit he's been waiting for. She will give birth to a son who he will name Edward. He is now going to be the legitimate male heir. Henry has his male. What's ironic about this is the period of time that we're going to talk about is not called the Edwardian period. It's not even called the Henrician period. It's called the Elizabethan age. His greatest heir will never be his son. It will be actually this daughter that he essentially wrote off as being someone else's kid, and that is Princess Elizabeth. Now, just to talk about the others, because it's only fair, his fourth wife is Anne of Cleves. After Jane Seymour dies, he requests another bride, and they decide to go to the German territories and try to find a wife there. And so he sends his court painter to go and paint portraits of all the beautiful women in all the Germanic courts. And the one that he likes the most is Anne of Cleves. He loves the picture of her here by Holstein. Well, here's the problem with paintings at that time. Paintings at that time made you look as though how you wanted to look, not how you actually looked. And so this picture, today, we would call it airbrushed. Back then, it was simply, we make you look like you want to look. This picture makes her look very, for a, 1500s woman. She's an attractive woman. She's got a nice little waist and a pretty face. But she wasn't quite as beautiful as this. Now, Henry won't even wait. He sees this painting. He goes, I have to have her. She's mine. So they're going to do a proxy wedding. He'll send somebody to go stand in for her in Germany, in the Duchy of Cleves. She will send someone to come to England. They get married by proxy, and then she gets on a ship and heads to England. She lands at Dover, and he can't wait. He is super excited. He is ready. So he gets on his horse, and him and his men, they ride to meet her carriage. He intercepts it. He flings open the door and realizes, uh-oh, this was not what I ordered. By the way, the prime minister, at that time it was called the first minister, or chancellor, that made this match, he will immediately have him taken and beheaded for treason. He also puts a warrant out for the rest of the artists who painted this painting, but he was in Europe and he wasn't coming back, at least not now. So now he's married to this Anne of Cleves. He doesn't know what to do with her, and come to find out, they actually get along great. What's sad about this is, if he could have just gotten over some of the physical things he didn't like about her, she was probably the perfect match. Henry was a big partier. He loved to eat and drink and have a good time. She was the life of the party, from what we understand. She loved hunting and fishing and playing cards. He loved hunting, fishing, playing cards. Her family also was very fertile. So obviously she was going to be able to produce many heirs. But Henry just said, I can't do it. I need someone else. And so what he says to her, he buys her off. He says, here's what I'm going to do. Give me an annulment. I know you don't want to go back to that slum of Cleves, that Duchy of Cleves. You want to stay here in England. Well, I got a proposition. Give me an annulment, and I will adopt you as my sister. You will now become Princess Anne of England. You will be my sister just like my other sisters. And she does. She takes it. She ends up marrying an English lord. He gets money. They party the rest of his life. But he just can't stay married to her. And that's one of the great shames of Henry is this is probably, other than Catherine of Aragon, this is probably the woman he should have been with for the rest of his life. Because she truly would have been a great match for him. But because he perceived her to be flawed, he couldn't stay married to her. So sadly, that's how Anne of Cleves is disposed of. Next up is Lady Catherine Howard. What is there to say about Catherine Howard? Well, at this point in Henry's life, he's in his late 40s. So he's approximately 10 years older than me, approximately. He's like 48-ish, 47, somewhere around there. And Catherine Howard, I believe when she got married to him, and I could be a year or so off, I'm just using my memory here, but Catherine Howard, I believe, was about 15. I believe she was about 15 at the time that she died, or at the time that they got married, sorry. No, I'm going to take that back. She was 17. She was 16 or 17, depending on when her birthday fell. So just think about this for a minute. You guys, the majority of you in here are juniors and seniors. So Catherine Howard would have been a girl about your age. And she's marrying someone who's in his late 40s. Now, obviously, they don't have a lot in common. Now, she did come from a very important family, the Howard family. They were related to the Boleyns. As a matter of fact, I believe that her and Princess Elizabeth were actually second or third cousins. And the Howard family, they were very well known at court. They were very well respected. But Catherine Howard was 16, 17 years old. She was not interested in being married to this old man. Her parents forced her into this. And so, from what we understand, she was quite provocative. Yes, she would do her wifely duty and spend time with Henry VIII, but after she was done with him, she would then also visit with other men closer to her own age who could keep up with her. And unfortunately, that was found out. Henry had all of her lovers executed, and then he turned around and executed her. She was she had just turned about 19 years old at the time their marriage ended by her execution. So again, they say that, love is only a number, or that age is only a number, and love shouldn't matter what age it was. Well, yeah, 16, 17 with a person in their upper 40s, it didn't end well for Catherine Howard. The final of the wives of King Henry VIII is his last wife, the one that will survive him. And this is Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr is another English woman from a decent English family, not as high as the Boleyns or the Howards, but from the aristocracy. And Lady Catherine Parr will be lucky enough to marry him at the time when he is pretty much coming to the end of his life. She'll be more of a nurse than a wife. In many cases, a lot of people believe that their marriage wasn't even consummated, and if it was, maybe one time for legality. And that at this point in his life, Henry was obese, he was very ill, we believe he had diabetes, some even argue he may have untreated syphilis. He was in bad shape. And so Catherine Parr will be the one that's lucky enough to replace or live past him. Now, one thing she does do, she does force Henry to re-legitimize both of his daughters. Mary and Elizabeth become princesses again, under the reality that their brother will succeed them to the throne first. So we now have a stable succession. Edward will be king after Henry, and then the eldest daughter, Mary, and then Elizabeth will be behind them. Now, hopefully, obviously, they believe that Edward would marry, have children, and that would not be needed. As I said, Catherine Parr will still be alive when King Henry VIII dies, and Elizabeth and Mary, both of them, while she's still alive, will see her often. As a matter of fact, I believe Catherine Parr made it long enough to see her stepdaughter, second stepdaughter, Elizabeth, become queen. So Catherine Parr, the lucky one, she was the one that got in when he was running out of time. The third Tudor king is King Edward VI. Edward was born in October of 1537, and he became king around about right around the time he was going to turn 10. He wasn't quite 10. I believe he was 9 years old, right about to turn 10 when he became king here in 1547, and he's going to rule for about 9 years. He'll rule until 1553 when he's 15 years old. His father was Henry VIII, and his mother was Jane Seymour. Now, what Edward VI is going to do during his period of time is not much. He is going to essentially grow up, and it's the regents that Henry VIII left in charge, the Seymour family, that are going to be the ones that are running England. He would have, by the way, come into his majority when he turned 16, so he was just a few months off from ruling in his own right. He'll never marry. He never has children. And throughout most of his reign, he is ill. He is a very sickly child, very thin, not very healthy, was always coming down with colds and flus. And we do know that the final disease that ended him was most likely tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was a terrible problem in the 1500s in Europe. When Edward VI gets ill for the final time, he knows he's going to die. He has taken this Church of England and made it a more Protestant church. He fears that his sisters will do away with the Protestant work that he had done, so he decides to try to name a different heir. At first, he talked about marrying her and trying to produce a child before he died. Her name was Jane Grey. But he was too ill at this point, so he decided to change the law of England. And what he said is that he now has the right to name any royal heir that he can. And so he decides to name his cousin, Jane Grey, to be his heir, to be the next Queen of England. Well, when he dies in 1553, you now have two queens. The Edwardian people will name Jane Grey as Queen Jane I of England. Those that followed the legitimate succession will name Mary as Queen Mary I of England. Well, after a 9-day period, Mary's forces do end up seizing control of England, and Jane Grey is essentially beheaded. And there goes the 9-day reign of Queen Jane I. Jane didn't want to be queen anyway, so it was something that she was forced into. So this is one of those sad cases where, probably would have just been best to leave it alone. But she had to die, Mary firmly believed, or there would always be a problem to her reign. And she even talked about having her sister Elizabeth executed because she was so paranoid about this. Now, who is Mary? Well, Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the first of Henry's queens. She was the eldest child, legitimate child. So she, was quite a bit older than her brother. She was born in 1516, and she's going to reign over England from 1553 to 1558. When she's queen, she's going to enact what we call the Counter-Reformation. If Henry did the English Reformation, where he threw out the Catholics, he made the Church of England an English church that followed Catholic laws, but that he was the Pope of, and his son Edward made it more Protestant. Well, Mary's going to make it more Catholic. She's going to try to go back to England being a Catholic church. And for almost 5 years, that's what happens. They begin this counter-reformation. They begin burning Protestants at the stake. Protestants are heavily attacked in the streets for practicing their faith, so much so that the nickname for Mary is Bloody Mary. She's going to kill so many people that they begin to refer to her as Bloody Mary. What makes this even more interesting is she is not just the Queen of England, she's also the Queen of Spain. Her husband was Philip II, the King of Spain. They are going to essentially try to recreate Ferdinand and Isabella's reign of the two Catholic rulers, and this time being the two Catholic rulers of Spain and England. Problem is they never have any children. We don't know why. We're not sure if Mary was infertile or if Philip just wasn't doing something right. We don't know. We know that Philip has children of his own later on in life. So we can't say that it's him per se, but for some reason they just never have children. That is until mid-1557 when she announces that she's pregnant. And many people in England are not happy because they hoped that she would eventually die and be replaced with Elizabeth, who seemed to be a more moderate figure between Edward's ultra-Protestantism and Mary's ultra-Catholicism. Well, she's pregnant for about 11 months. And I know you might be saying, wait a minute, babies don't, you're pregnant for 10 months. They always say you're pregnant for 9 months, but you're actually pregnant for 9 months to the very end of that 9th month, which means 10 months. So after the 2 months have gone by after, that she should have given birth, she's getting ready to go into her 12th month of pregnancy. They begin to realize she's not pregnant. Now, we don't know what was wrong with her. We don't know if she had some kind of stomach cancer or if she had uterine cancer or what was wrong with her specifically. But in November of 1558, at 42 years old, she does die. Some people say it's one of those two cancers that had caused her stomach to swell. Others believe, and there is this weird thing about the human mind, that the mind can actually play tricks on your body, that she wanted to be pregnant so badly that her mind actually tricked her into believing that she was pregnant, and she retained fluid and started, having pregnancy type symptoms. We don't know if she died of cancer per se, or if she died of a broken heart when she found out that she was just not going to have a child. But in November of 1558, she dies. And now the second of Henry's 3 legitimate heirs is now dead without an heir of their own. Now the final ruler of the Tudor dynasty is Queen Elizabeth I. She was born in September of 1533, and she will reign the longest of all of the Tudors. She will reign from 1558 to 1603. Elizabeth is going to be, even though Henry was so obsessed with having a female ruler, Elizabeth I will be the greatest of his heirs. In fact, will be even greater than him and his father, and that's why we refer to this as the Elizabethan era, or the Elizabethan age. As I said, she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, so she was the second eldest child of King Henry VIII. She herself will never get married. She will never have any children. And part of this is because of the trauma that she will have as a child. She literally sees, she's heard the stories about how her mother was executed for treason. Her stepmother, Jane Seymour, who we see that there was a fondness for, dies in childbirth. And then her next stepmother, who was a child who's barely older than her, Catherine Howard, is drugged from the palace and executed for treason. Elizabeth wants no part of that. So she will essentially say that she is not going to marry anyone, that England will be her consort, and that she will bear no children. So when she dies in 1603 at the age of 69 years old, she does die without producing an heir, and this brings an end to the Tudor dynasty. Now, what is important about Elizabeth? There's so much we could talk about with Elizabeth, but what we're going to talk about is realistically the events that will lead to the English exploring the New World. Now, the English have done a little exploring under Henry VII, a little bit under Henry VIII, but for the most part, they've ignored the New World. This is going to change here under Elizabeth I. Now, some of the major policies that Elizabeth's going to do. Now, the first thing she has to think about is, what am I going to do with England's church? As we talked about, Henry VIII created a Catholic church without a pope. Her brother then turned around and created a very Protestant Calvinist church. And then her sister went the complete opposite way and tried to bring back Catholicism. And so Elizabeth, being a more moderate, she has to do something to rebuild the religious institutions in England. So what she's going to do is she's going to go in the middle. She's not going to go Protestant Calvinist like her brother. She's not going to go Catholic like her sister. She's going to create the modern Church of England, the Anglican Church, which is here in the United States, we refer to them as the Episcopalians. This is a church that's going to be both Catholic and Protestant in its teachings. It's not going to have a pope like the Catholic Church. It's going to be controlled by local authorities like the Protestant churches are. It's going to emphasize that it is the heir to the Catholic and apostolic traditions. So it's going to still claim to evolve from the Catholic Church and from the apostles of Jesus. But they're going to have a more moderate, modern Reformed doctrine. And the doctrine that's created to run this church is called the 39 Articles. These are essentially Protestantism with a touch of Catholic flavor. One thing she will do, though, in 1558 is pass what's called the Act of Supremacy, where the monarch will not only be the head of state, but also the head of state church. But instead of being the supreme leader of the church like her father had been, she is going to call herself the supreme governor of the Church of England. And all office holders, whether they're secular or religious, will have to swear an oath of loyalty to the king or queen. This is still in effect today. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom is still the supreme governor of the Church of England. And when office holders take their oath of loyalty, they don't do it to the Constitution of the United Kingdom. They take their oath of loyalty to the king or queen, in that case, Queen Elizabeth II. Another thing that she does is the Act of Uniformity of 1558. This is where all English subjects are required to attend church once a week. If you don't attend church, you will be fined 12 pence. So it is now your legal obligation to go to church. Well, that's very important because one thing we're going to talk about when we talk about the creation of the new United States government is, a lot of people want to talk about church and state, the separation of church and state. Well, whether you believe it or not, there are people who say there's no such thing. There is. And one of the reasons you can point to that is that when we create the new American government in the 1780s, this is one of these things, the Act of Uniformity, that is brought up, which is why we have separation of church and state, is that the government of England required people to go to church once a week, or they could be fined. And there wasn't, by the way, like a choice like we have here in the United States. You could be a Baptist or you could be a Episcopalian. You had to go to a Church of England. You also had to use the Common Book of Prayer, which was written in 1552. So keep that in mind when we start talking about the American Revolution, I think it's next week, actually. If it's not next week, it's the week after. Also, the Supremacy of the Crown Act was done in 1562. This made refusing to swear an oath of loyalty to your monarch a capital offense. So if you refuse to swear your oath of loyalty to your supreme governor, it was a death penalty offense. So again, all these things you got to think about when we start talking about the American Revolution, and 2 weeks from now when we talk about the founding of the American government we know today and the idea of separation of church and state. Well, now that we know what the religious situation was under Queen Elizabeth I, now we have to start thinking about who is her heir. Well, at this time, the heir to the throne is actually the Queen of Scots, Mary. Mary was actually a member of the Tudor family. She is the daughter of King James V and his wife, Mary of Guise, but she is the granddaughter of Henry the Eighth's sister, Princess Margaret of England. That meant that if Elizabeth dies without an heir, that she is her first cousin once removed. That means she is the next legitimate heir to the English throne. So everyone knows that she is now the heir presumptive, that if the English throne were to be vacant after Elizabeth dies, it will go to Mary and her heirs. Elizabeth knows this, and she's okay with this at the time, because the reality of it is she's been a queen for a long time. She was 6 days old, actually, when she became Queen of Scots. Her father was killed in battle against the English. And she's also been married for a few years to the King of France. King Francois II. And after he died in 1560, she's sent home to Scotland. And even though she's nominally a Catholic, she's the ruler of a Protestant country, and it's fine. Well, what happens here, basically, is that after she's done some naughty things in Scotland, I'm not going to get into all of them, but essentially she's thrown out. They depose her. They send her into exile into England, and her very young son, who's only a few weeks old, will become King James VI. He's going to be the King of Scots. So the nobles have possession of her 6-month-old son. They will raise him to be king of Scotland. She is now going to be in exile in England, and Elizabeth will lock her up. And for the next 20 years, she's going to be in a royal castle near London under the watchful eyes of Elizabeth I. Now, what happens is that the Catholics on the mainland want to return England to Catholic rule. So they decide they're going to try to get the English to lead a coup. And if that doesn't work, they will invade England themselves. They will take Elizabeth out, and they will put Mary on the throne and bring the Catholic faith back to England. Well, Elizabeth I finds out about this. She has her put on trial for treason. She's sentenced to death, but Elizabeth refuses to sign the death warrant. She just keeps saying, I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it. So the story is here in the early 1580s, 1585 or 1586, I can't remember the exact date. But what happens is, and this is the story that she tells. Now, we don't believe it, but the death warrant for Elizabeth was put into some other papers, and her advisor says, sign these papers for me, sign this, sign here, sign here, sign here. And Mary, Queen of Scots, is actually executed by the English. Now, when Elizabeth, quote unquote, finds out, she's furious. She removes all these ministers from her employment. She then gives them titles of nobility. And then when people ask her about it, she goes, I was misled. I was taken advantage of. I am just a woman. I didn't know what I was doing. Well, what's funny about Elizabeth is she's quite crafty. She's only, quote unquote, just a woman when she can use the excuse. We do not believe that she did not read the death warrant. It was just the time that she felt Mary had to go. But she always had that plausible deniability. What, me? No, I wouldn't have done that. I would have never killed my cousin and heir. I'm just a woman. I didn't know what I was reading. It was my advisors. They did it. Well, if her advisors were really to blame, they would have been executed next, and they were rewarded. So that's how we know, basically, that she was fibbing a little bit on this. Well, the Catholic authorities in the continent of Europe were not happy by what happened to Mary. And so what the Spanish decide to do here in 1588 is they're going to lead an all-out invasion to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. Not only were they mad about Mary, Queen of Scots, being executed, they wanted to stop the English from being involved in the Spanish Netherlands. At this time, Spain controlled the Netherlands, which we call the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and some of those other smaller areas. And the English had been really getting the Protestants riled up, trying to cause problems for both the French and Spanish Catholics. So there's one thing that this invasion's hoping to do. The other thing is they want to return England to the Catholic faith. They are obsessed with this, that a Catholic faith without England is just not a Catholic faith. And the third is the English have been attacking Spanish ships in the Caribbean. And they hope by invading and taking out Elizabeth that the privateering in the Caribbean will stop. By the way, this is blessed by the Pope. Pope Sixtus V will actually bless it and give money to fund this campaign. Philip II of Spain will have a fleet of 151 ships, 8,000 sailors, 18,000 soldiers, with 1,500 brass guns and 1,000 horses. And they all meet up in the Spanish Netherlands. The Spanish army and all the other forces that Pope Sixtus V will get to come help from all over Christendom. And by the time they get everybody together, the invasion force will be about 30,000 people. That is more than enough to invade and conquer England. England's in big trouble here in 1588. The armada that was built, the 151 ships, the majority of that is to shield the main invasion force. They're going to attack and destroy the small English navy and allow the barges to take the 30,000 troops across. Prior to this happening, by the way, Pope Sixtus V is going to publish what he called the Admonition to the Nobility and People of England. This is essentially his warning. He says, you need to remove Elizabeth yourself. You need to remove Elizabeth yourself, or we're going to do it. So he warns them of the Spanish invasion. Pope Sixtus V says, not only am I excommunicating Elizabeth I as a heretic, I am also going to tell you once and for all that she is the product of incest between Anne Boleyn and her brother, which was Henry's lie about Anne Boleyn in order to have her executed. He also will say that Elizabeth should be removed by the nobility as Queen of England, and that England would then become part of the Spanish Empire, that England would become a protectorate, and Philip II would become their king. Well, the English nobility obviously rally around Elizabeth I. So now we're going to have a war here between the Spanish and the English in 1588, and historically we refer to this as the Spanish invasion or the Spanish Armada. Now, the handsome devil on the left is King Philip II of Spain. He was the eldest son of Emperor Charles V. What happened was when he married Mary, since Mary was the Queen of England, he did not feel that it was right for his son to marry a queen when he was simply a prince of the realm. So he actually created an independent kingdom of Spain and made Philip II the king of that. Now you might say, wait a minute, what do you mean by an independent kingdom of Spain? Well, remember at this point, Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor. He is the king of Spain. He is the emperor of the New World. So what he does is he essentially stays the emperor, but he makes his son a king. And so his son and his son's heirs will be the rulers of Spain. On the right is Pope Sixtus V. He will be the religious authority that will run this Spanish invasion. He will be the one that gives them their credibility. Now, right before the battle, Elizabeth will go to meet with her military command. And she decides to give them a speech. where she tries to bring up their morale. And she gives one of the most important lines in military history. She tells her men, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." And so what she's essentially saying is, I might be a female, but I am every much determined as a male king of England that we will be victorious. Now, England does not have the navy that they need to defeat this Spanish Armada. They have a very small navy, not up to the task. But Elizabeth will request every single floating vessel they can find. Many of them barely seaworthy. And they are going to load them with everything they can find flammable. The goal is to take out as many of the Spanish ships as they can. Now, what happens here on August 8th, 1588, we call the Battle of Gravelines. And this is essentially the Battle of the English Channel, the Spanish Armada. The English will sneak up on this Spanish Armada at anchor, preparing the invasion of England. And they will give them everything they can. They catch them off guard. All these old derelict ships that can barely float, that are loaded with flammable materials, they are essentially steered into the heart of the Spanish Armada. These Spanish ships are big, they're not maneuverable, they're in harbor at the time, and they can't escape. Also, a storm comes up at the end of this, so by the time it's all said and done, 50 to 100 Englishmen are killed, 400 wounded. But 600 plus Spanish are killed, 800 are wounded, 397 are captured, and 5 of their largest ships are sunk or captured. The result of this is just absolutely devastating for the Spanish. Not only will the Spanish invasion of England fail, Elizabeth I will remain queen, and the state will become more and more Protestant until you have the modern Church of England today, which is most definitely a Protestant church. England will also now replace Spain as the maritime power. Spain will be the second tier country. It had been since 1492 the world superpower. Now England is beginning to emerge as the superpower. Okay, within 100 years, the Spanish Empire will be a shell of its former self, and the English Empire, or at that point, more correctly, the British Empire, there's a saying about it, that the sun never set on the British Empire, and there's a reason for that, because they'll have land holdings all around the world. So England will now be on the rise, and Spain will be in decline. Now, that's not the ending of the Armada, though. When they leave Gravelines, they have to get back to Spain, and I can show you the map up here that this is how they got back. Instead of going through the channel and trying to get back to Spain. Now, I said 5 ships were sunk, and you might have said, well, it's a complete disaster for the Spanish. How was that be when 5 ships were sunk and a couple hundred were killed? Well, what happens is the Spanish fleet has to go around Great Britain, the islands of Great Britain and Ireland, to get home. And if you look at what happens, in this period of time, 51 ships are destroyed. Some ships are damaged so badly that 10 of them have to actually be scuttled. They sink them themselves. And of that 30,000 man invasion force, 20,000 men are lost. As I said, this is a disaster for the Kingdom of Spain. The Spanish Empire may still exist in the New World, but they are no longer the dominant maritime power. It is now most definitely the English/British period. Next are the Stuart dynasty, which will rule over England from 1603 to 1714. The Stuart dynasty were the Scottish dynasty. They ruled over Scotland for the past couple of centuries. And this will now, the English have always tried to invade and conquer Scotland because the English king had always wanted to have the Scottish crown. Now you will have a Scottish king come and sit upon the English throne. So it's the complete reversal of what the English kings have been trying to do since 1100, 1200 AD. They had wanted to take the Scottish throne for themselves. Now it's a Scot. It's James the Sixth of Scotland will now become King James the First of England. King James VI of Scotland was 37 years old when he received the news that he was also now the King of England. The new king was a complete change from the previous dynasty. James was born in June of 1566, and he will rule over Scotland from basically an infant from 1567 to 1625, and over England from the death of Elizabeth in 1603 to 1625. What can we say about King James VI and the First? Well, he had a tongue that was too big for his mouth, so he did kind of slobber and drool when he talked. He never washed or wore what we would consider to be normal clothing. All of his clothing was heavy and padded. This was to protect him from assassination attempts. He did have multiple assassination attempts both in Scotland and in England during his reign. He was married, although today we would probably go as far as to say that he was either bisexual or homosexual. He had children. He had 4 children: Henry Frederick, the Prince of Wales, Elizabeth, Charles, who will become Charles I, and Robert. But he preferred to spend most of the time with male friends. Now, again, we don't know for sure, but we do believe it was heavily inferred that he was more into males than females. But what we do know about him also is he was intelligent, he was shrewd, and he was well experienced by the time he became King of England. As I said, he was less than a year old when he became the King of the Scots. So when he became King of England here in 1603, he was already highly capable at ruling. Many people considered him to be 2 men in one body. Some people saw him as a nervous, driveling idiot, while others would say he was a witty, well-read scholar. He enjoyed writing and arguing and publishing verses on different topics. He loved the paranormal. He loved political theory. He also wrote a book on the hazard, or a pamphlet on the health hazard of smoking, here in the mid-1620s. He also personally supervised the creation of the English language Bible. That is why this Bible is dedicated in his honor. We call it the King James Version of the Bible. As King of both England and Scotland, he began to call himself and his island nation Great Britain. He'll even go so far as to name himself the King of Great Britain. Even though that's not official until the 1700s, he will still be King James VI of Scotland and First of England. Because of the fact that some people saw him as kind of an idiot and others saw him as just an absolute genius, he does get this reputation as being the wisest fool in all of Christendom. Just a couple things about James. James introduced golf and horse racing from his native Scotland to England, so there's a positive. Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, who had been the darling of the Elizabethan art movement, will commission many of his later plays under the reign of King James I. If you notice that many of his early plays were, the Henry V's, Henry IV's, all the different ones that led up to the Tudor dynasty. If you look at his newer plays towards the end of Shakespearean literature, the Scottish tragedy of Macbeth, who had the Scottish king and witches, both of which pleased the Scottish king who was into the paranormal. James I will actually even give Shakespeare a royal title called the King's Players. So if you ever hear about Shakespeare being called part of the King's Players, that was the official endorsement of the King of England. Now, although he is initially popular in England, he eventually becomes fairly unpopular. By about the mid 16 teens, 1610, 1615, people began to see James I as not the ideal king, and there's three main reasons for this. First of all, he was a foreigner. He was born and raised a Scottish king. Yes, he was the legitimate male heir to the Tudor dynasty, but he brings in this new Stuart dynasty, which was very Scottish, very French in its flavor, and also very Protestant, more Protestant than the Church of England. As I said before, he's also unpopular because most people saw him as blatantly homosexual. The English wanted their kings to at least pretend to be heterosexual. Again, we don't know 100%, but it was heavily implied in his personal life that that was true. Many people in England did not like that. They saw that as aghast to the good policies of and good taste of England. The third thing is he believed in divine right of kings. And divine right of kings is a philosophy that said that essentially a person was chosen by God to be king. Therefore, he is not to be questioned. Now, this is opposed to the Tudor dynasty, who ruled as absolute monarchs through the consent of Parliament. Instead, what James VI and First is going to say is, I don't need Parliament. I have the ordination of God. So it's going to leave a lot of problems. Now, towards the end of his reign, King James I will become senile. He'll begin to deteriorate both physically and mentally. And shortly before his death in March of 1625, he'll even suffer a stroke. And his first child's name was Henry Frederick. He was the Prince of Wales. He was the heir to the throne, but he will die early on. Henry Frederick was trained to be king from an early age. Charles was not. And so Charles, at the age of 12, will have to step up and then replace his brother, Henry Frederick, as the heir to the throne. And he will not have the same time to prepare to be king when he is finally elevated to the kingship in 1625. King Charles I. Charles I was born shortly before his father became the King of England. He was born in Scotland in November of 1600. And everything that James was, Charles was basically the reverse. Charles was pious. He was religious. He did not have much of a sense of humor. We do know he was 24 years old when he became king. As I said, he was not as prepared as his brother was, because his brother had been trained since birth to be king. But Charles, one thing he did adopt from his father was this belief in absolute monarchy under the divine right of kings mantra. This becomes a problem for him, though, because at the very same time that he is king, you have a very large middle-class nobility, and they begin to rebel. And here between 1642 and 1649, there is a civil war in England. Eventually, Charles will be defeated by the Royalists, or by the Roundhead, who were the anti-royalist, and they will convict him of treason and sentence him to death. They will essentially they will do away with the monarchy by killing the king. And so Charles I will step onto the scaffold outside of the Palace of Whitehall. He will speak to those assembled before his execution, and he says, essentially one of the great lines in English history, he says, quote, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown where no disturbance can be." And then he, of course, puts his head on the block and is executed. He will be the last ruler until 1660. So over the next 11 years, there will be no monarchy. Now, who takes over? Well, from 1653 to 1658, the ruler of England is a guy by the name of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell is a Puritan military leader who, during the Civil War, was essentially the top general. Now, he was offered the crown. He was offered to become king here after the death of Charles I. But instead, he wanted to serve first as chairman of the Council of State from 1649 to 1653, and then from 1653 until his death in 1658, he took the title of Lord Protector. But he is going to have less restraint on him than even the Stuart dynasty had. He will rule basically as a dictator. He will rule by decree. He doesn't even need the consent of Parliament. So he's going to be even more of an absolute monarch than the divine right of kings. He even had an official coronation as Lord Protector. He lived in a palace. He lived in Hampton Palace. So basically, he was the monarch of England and saying that he was the head of a republican government. Well, Cromwell, let's just put it this way. He has no sense of humor. Cromwell outlaws dances and plays. He declares war on the Church of England. They go into the great cathedrals and pillage and plunder. They take all the riches of the English nobility. They raid the tombs of all the former kings of England. They literally just throw these tombs, they open them up, knock them over, take all the good stuff out, and then leave the bodies just laying there. He also, though, began to welcome Jews back into England, so there's a positive. And towards the end of his rule, he even began to moderate his behavior a little bit. He began allowing music to be played in public, but mainly religious music. You're not going to see music being played for entertainment anymore. Now, he dies in September of 1658, ironically on the anniversary of two of his greatest victories. We'll talk about what happens to him after death in a few minutes. Now, Richard Cromwell himself is the son of Oliver Cromwell, and when Oliver dies in 1658, Richard will become the Lord Protector of England. Once he takes office, though, he realizes he is just not capable of being a head of state, and he's forced to dissolve Parliament very quickly upon taking over. And he then calls for a parliament that had been friendly to his father, which was called the Rump Parliament of 1653. He's now going to have the Rump Parliament of 1658, but he realizes very quickly on that this is just not going to work. He is not qualified to be there, so he decides to abdicate his position as Lord Protector of England here in May of 1659. He'll then go into exile. And so here in 1660, we now have a situation where we have no head of state. Just to tell you what happens to the Cromwell boys, both of them, first of all, don't feel too bad for Oliver Cromwell. He's going to get dug up here after the Restoration. His body's going to be dug up, his body's going to be hanged, and then he's going to be chopped into pieces. As far as the son goes, there is a popular story. We don't know if this is true or not, but supposedly there was a ceremony in 1709 that was being presided over by Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs. And one of the people turned to some older gentleman, about 83 years old at the time, and commented on the spectacle and said, quote, "Have you ever seen such a sight before?" And this gentleman turned and said, quote, "Never since I sat in her chair." And supposedly it had been Richard Cromwell. We don't know if it's true. That's just a story that is told over and over. Well, in 1660, the government of England is now controlled by a military dictatorship, and they're trying to figure out what to do with England. The head of the military was the Duke of Albemarle. The guy's name was George Monk, the Duke of Albemarle. And he is going to dissolve Parliament and hold new elections. And once these new elections are held, they have to ask the question, what kind of government will England now have? Well, the newly elected assembly will vote to restore the Stuart dynasty, and they will invite the former crown prince, Charles, to return to England as king. Now, Prince Charles, has been considering himself to be king for quite a long time. Um, Charles has been declaring himself from the time of his father's death in 1649. He has been styling himself as King Charles II. Um, but when they come to him in the Netherlands, at this point, he's in the Netherlands, um, they ask him to guarantee a certain rights and privileges for the English. And what he does is he writes the Declaration of Breda, where he says that he will not punish the English people other than those that were personally responsible for the murder of his father, that he would promise to regularly consult Parliament, and that he would guarantee the rights of the aristocracy and grant religious toleration. Once these things were all agreed to by Parliament, Prince Charles will return to England as King Charles II, and he'll rule from May of 1660 to February of 1685. Now, some things about Charles II. He's an interesting character. First of all, he's a very cultured monarch. Many people in English history today, while they may not consider him the great English king, they do believe that he was very important to England by restoring England to a more happy place. England under the Cromwells, it was not a great place. You can imagine these were Puritans. We're going to talk about the Puritans again even more when we get to the colonies. But as a cultured man, he's going to restore England's theaters, which were closed during the Puritan era. He's going to patronize the arts. He creates the Royal Society of Arts and Sciences. He lived in France in exile and the Netherlands, and it gave him sophisticated tastes. He wanted to make England as sophisticated as the continent of Europe itself. His wife, Catherine of Braganza, was a Portuguese princess. She herself was very wealthy, provided a dowry of money, the cities of Bombay and Tangiers, and she also brought with her trading posts in India and China. She was not able to produce a legitimate male heir for Charles II, but she was able to provide a lot of wealth and substance to their marriage. One thing about Charles that we remember is he brought the fun back to England after the Puritan dictatorship. He was a good-humored man. He was relaxed. He was self-indulgent. And the attitude seemed to rub off on the English people. Charles II had many mistresses and many illegitimate children, and the nation as a whole just laughed it off as good fun. No one seemed to care that he was kind of a scoundrel. In fact, many English became a little scoundrelly themselves. He also promised to share power with Parliament as a condition to being restored to the throne, and that is a promise he kept. He showed the English people that he had learned from his father's mistakes. But unfortunately, in 1685, at the age of 51, King Charles II will die unexpectedly, and he will be succeeded by his brother, James, the Duke of York. James, the Duke of York, the second son of King Charles I, will now become King James VII and II. He was born in October of 1633, and he'll be king from 1685 to 1688. James II was as unpopular with his subjects as his brother was popular. James II was a serious, inflexible human being. He was the wrong religion. He was Catholic, and he believed in a more absolutist style of government like his father and grandfather before him. James, while still the Duke of York, will convert to Catholicism in 1669. Most English subjects believed that this middle-aged heir would be gone soon, and his next in line for the throne was his daughter Mary. His eldest son Charles, the Duke of Cambridge, died fairly early on in his life, so he has two daughters that remain, Mary II, who will become Queen of England and Scotland, and then Anne, who becomes Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and we'll talk about how that happens in a few minutes. So he's middle-aged, his wife is middle-aged, and so they don't believe that it's going to be a problem. Mary and Anne are both raised in the court of Charles II. Charles II has raised them to be Protestants, so there's no problem. We'll have to deal with this Catholic king for a few years. He'll die, and then we'll get our Protestant king back, or ruler back. Well, when Anne Hyde dies, he then decides here in 1673, he decides to marry a 15-year-old Italian princess by the name of Mary of Modena. And by the way, many of the English people do not like her. They see her as a possible agent of the Pope. But again, no child, no big deal. Well, in 1688, his wife, Queen Mary, gives birth to James Francis Edward Stuart, who will now be the Prince of Wales. He is now the first in line to the English throne, not the third, remember, because boys jump girls. A few years later, Louisa Maria Theresa Stuart will be born. She will be the Princess Royale, which is the title that is normally given to the king's eldest daughter. But I'll explain, basically what happens there in a minute. He's no longer in England, so the title means very little. Now, if the birth of a Catholic heir replacing two Protestant heirs isn't enough to be a problem, here in 1688, King James will have the Parliament pass what they call the Test Acts. The Test Acts of 1688. And this will say that the king now has the right to put a religious test to qualify candidates for government service. He will use this to disqualify or remove all Protestant officials and replace them with Catholics. Again, when you ask why the American Revolution was set up in a way where we have a separation of church and state, this is, we talked about the first one with the different Elizabethan laws that made it requirement for you to go to church. Now we have a requirement where you have to be a certain religion in order to be work in the government. Obviously, we don't have that here in the United States, and it's because the Test Act was seen as a reason to not incorporate church and state together. And so the Test Act of 1688 is not only offensive to the English, but here in the 1780s, when we're writing our own Constitution, we think of this. We keep this in mind. Another bill that James the Second and Seventh has passed is called the Declaration of Indulgences. And this is a bill that is designed to give the appearance of more religious freedom in England. And what it's going to do is it's designed to remove some of the legal bans against Catholicism. So what he is doing is he is basically stripping the Protestantism of England away in hopes of reconverting England into a Catholic faith in the future. So that's what he's up to. He's in the process of slowly but surely returning England to the one true universal Catholic Church. The problem is Parliament sees what he's doing. They know what's going on, and they realize that there is a major danger of a Catholic restoration here. And so what Parliament will do is it will send 7 Protestant bishops that are known in history as the Immortal Seven. And they are going to go to the Netherlands, where Princess Mary is living with her husband, Prince William of Orange, a Protestant king, and ask her to assume the throne as Queen Mary II of England. So they are essentially asking the daughter and her husband to overthrow her father and her younger brother as the king and the next king of England. And what happens next is known as the Glorious Revolution. Sometimes it's referred to as the Revolution of 1688. And what this is it's essentially a revolution because of the constitutional changes that James the Seventh and Second is trying to enact But in many ways, this revolution, which is a counter-constitutional change, is more of an invasion, because a foreign power is actually invading and seizing the English government by force. Yes, at the behest of the legitimately elected English government, parliament, and sometimes that's why we refer to this as the bloodless revolution, because you're going to see a switch of monarchs here happen relatively peacefully. Now, the army of Prince William of Orange will land in 1688. They will march to London. King James II is deposed. He's locked in the Tower of London. Somehow, while trying to figure out what to do with their former king, he escapes. He gets to a seaside palace. He then gets out, crosses the English Channel to France, and he'll live there until he dies in exile in 1701. So now the king has left. Now the king is left. So he's taken essentially himself out of the equation. The question was, what are we going to do with him? Well, now what the convention will say is that since James II was still king, him leaving meant that he abdicated his authority, whether he signed an abdication or not. So he is no longer still the king. But the question is whether Mary automatically becomes queen, or they have to offer the throne to James Francis Edward, the Prince of Wales, or if the throne is just vacant, period. What they decide to do is they decide to declare the throne vacant, and they offer it jointly to Prince William and Princess Mary of Orange, and that they would rule together. So theoretically, as long as they agree to this, you will now have King William III and Queen Mary II of England. They are asked about this. They both agree, and they're asked to swear an oath not to break any laws that Parliament makes during the convention. And the laws that they create during the convention, you're going to notice that a lot of them look similar to things that we have here in the United States. These are going to be known as the Declaration of Rights. Now, the English Declaration of Rights of 1689, again, some of these are going to look very similar to something or some document we have here. First of all, they called the crown, the entity of the crown, not the specific person, but the office of the crown, the king or queen. They will consider it the fount of justice. And what this means is that the king or queen is supposed to uphold the law. And therefore, the king or queen cannot unilaterally suspend laws or create special courts. Everything has to go through the traditional legal system. They also said that the crown, the king or the queen, was the commander-in-chief of all armed forces, but that they could not use the army against the citizens of England or Scotland without approval of Parliament. So you have to get Parliament's permission to use the army on your own people. The crown cannot levy taxes by royal decree. All taxation must come from Parliament, the elected people of England. The crown must allow for frequent parliamentary sessions. They can't go years without having parliamentary sessions, and they have to have regularly scheduled elections every so often. The crown must also allow freedom of speech within Parliament. That means that there can be a pro-government and an anti-government faction. In England, this is called the loyal opposition. So no one will be punished at this point for opposing the government. Now, let's be clear, when we talk about the government, we're talking about the prime minister. The king or queen is still beyond reproach even today. If you hear when the loyal opposition, at this point, I believe it's still the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, when they get up and they attack the government, you will never hear them attack Her Majesty the Queen. They will always attack my friend from so and so, the prime minister. But they are allowed to have these vicious debates within Parliament because of this idea of protecting the loyal opposition. Citizens have the right to petition the government, the crown, for things. The government must not sanction things deemed cruel or unusual punishment. That includes excessive bail. That is one that you guys probably have heard of a time or two. And then three that we really don't deal with here in the United States. One thing is Protestant citizens have the right to own a firearm for protection. We do have a Second Amendment in our Constitution, but it doesn't just have one different group. And by the way, yes, Roman Catholics were not allowed to own firearms in England. Roman Catholics were also barred from the English throne going forward, and no monarch or their heirs can succeed to the throne if they're married to a Catholic. That just changed within the last few years. Now the heir cannot be a Catholic, but the heir's wife could be, as long as the children declare to be part of the Church of England. And again, that's realistically because the king or queen of the United Kingdom is also the head of the Church of England. How can a Catholic be the head of the Church of England when the Church of England's Protestant? So it basically makes sense. Finally, Catholics are barred from voting, holding public office, and serving as officers in the royal court. So obviously you can tell there's not a lot of love here for Catholics in England. So now what we have is we have King William III of England and second of the Netherlands, because as he is king of the of England at this time, he also elevates the Netherlands to a kingdom for a period of time. His wife will now be Queen Mary II. William III will be king from 1689 to 1702, and Queen Mary II will be queen from 1689 to 1694. These two are first cousins. I believe William's mother was the sister of King James II of England. So that makes Mary and William cousins, first cousins. They will rule together. And the way this works is Mary is the queen by right. William is the king by choice. And whoever dies first, the other one will reign until they die. And so when Mary dies in 1694, William III is allowed to stay on the throne until 1702. Now, there's another caveat to this, in that when he dies, any child that he has, unless it's with Mary, is not allowed to inherit the throne. So if Mary dies and he gets remarried, he cannot pass the throne on to that child. It has to go to Mary II's sister, Anne, and her descendants. So as you can see, here is the information on William III of England, second of Scotland. As I said, he was the Prince of Orange, Stadtholder of Holland. He does become the king of the Netherlands as well. And in both, he is technically the second of Scotland and the second of the Netherlands. When you look at this, though, when you look at how this works, both of them, like I said, they're cousins. They're cousins. William the Third was the son of William II, Prince of Orange, and Princess Mary of England, and Mary II was the daughter of Princess Mary of England's brother, James II, and 7th of England and Scotland, and Anne Hyde, the Duchess of York, who, as I said, died before he became king. They never had any children together. We're not 100% sure why. We don't know if there was some kind of physical reason, but we do know that they were childless when she died in 1694. And so she'll reign until 1694, and then he'll reign until 1702. Now, when King William III dies, the throne will pass to his sister-in-law, and his sister-in-law is Princess Anne. Princess Anne will now become Queen Anne of England. Anne was the second eldest daughter of James II. So now the question is what to do with the throne, because when William III dies, the throne will pass to his sister-in-law. But it's not sure where that line of succession will go. So what they decide to do is they're going to try to be as fair as they can. They say, okay, William III is king. He is king. When he dies, the throne will go to Princess Anne. And if Princess Anne and her husband, Prince George of Denmark, do not have any legitimate children, then the next in line to the throne is Prince James Francis Edward, the former Prince of Wales. He's now a teenager at this point. In order to inherit the throne, though, he'll have to convert to the Anglican Church and renounce Catholicism. And if he does these things, when Anne is dead, if she does not have any children, he will become King James III and VIII of England and Scotland. But if he does not, him and his heirs will be barred from the throne forever. If James Francis Edward decides not to convert to the Anglican Church and renounce Catholicism, then they'll have to go up the line, and the next eligible person for the throne will be the Protestant descendants of Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of King James I. The heir to Princess Elizabeth at this time is Princess Sophia of Hanover, and if Sophia of Hanover is dead, the next in line to her is her son, Prince George of Hanover. Queen Anne was born in 1665, and she'll die in 1714. She will reign over England and Scotland from March of 1702 to May of 1707. After May of 1707, she will rule over Great Britain. And she'll rule over Great Britain from 1707 to 1714. Anne was married to Prince George of Denmark, and she has one child, William, the Duke of Gloucester. Now, the Duke of Gloucester was a very sickly child, and by the time he dies in 1711 or 1712, it's obvious that Queen Anne is going to have no further children. And so this does become a real issue. The House of Stuart is guaranteed, like the Tudor Stuart, to go extinct. Now, why does she go from being the Queen of England and Scotland to being the Queen of the Great Britain, as it says in the slide? Well, in 1707, Parliament will pass the Act of Union of 1707. And what this will do is this will take the separate governments of England, Scotland, and Wales and unite them under one monarch and one parliament. And they will call this new entity the United Kingdom of Great Britain. This is the founding of modern UK or Great Britain today. Okay, and that's why I'm very clear when I talk about Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II. She is not the Queen of England technically. She's not the Queen of Scotland or Wales. She's the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. If those countries were to then separate and go their separate ways and kept her as monarch, she would then be the Queen of England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, so on and so on. So now, instead of it being two kingdoms and a principality being ruled over by one person, now it's one government being ruled over by one person. Instead of having three parliaments, you now have one. And this is the Act of Union of 1707. In 1714, Anne dies. And she dies without a legitimate male heir. Prince James Francis Edward is offered the throne under the conditions of becoming an Anglican and renouncing the Catholic faith. He refuses. He will try to get the throne in a civil war after this, but he is never successful. So now the Protestant descendants of Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of King James I, will now become the next rulers of Great Britain. And these are the Hanoverian dynasty, and they'll rule from 1714 to 1901. Now, sadly, Princess Sophia of Hanover will die before she can make the claim as being the Queen of the United Kingdom. So it's up to her son, Prince George, who will become the first of the Hanoverian kings. King George I will be the King of the United Kingdom from 1714 to 1727. George I was born in May of 1660 in Hanover. His father was Ernst Augustus, the Elector of Hanover, and his mother was Sophia, the Countess Palatine, the Electress of Hanover. He was married to Sophia Dorothea of Celle, and he becomes the Elector of Hanover in January of 1698, and he'll continue on until 1727 as the Elector of Hanover and eventually the Prince of Hanover. He will be the King of the United Kingdom until he dies in June of 1727. Now, one thing about George I is he's going to spend very little time in the United Kingdom. He is only going to be king for, I guess it's about 13 years. And he never learns the language. He doesn't learn English. He doesn't like much about England. And so when he dies in 1727, most of the English people really have no attachment to this king. He's more of a transitional king in that respect. Now, someone who embraces the kingship of the United Kingdom a little more is his son, King George II. Now, George II was born in 1683 while his father was still the Elector of Hanover. And he will reign as both the King of the United Kingdom and Elector of Hanover from 1727 to 1760. So he's going to be king for quite a while. And he's married to Caroline of Ansbach. And they do have quite a few children. The most important is Frederick, the Prince of Wales. And you notice there's no king afterwards because George II outlives most of the, out of the male heir that counts, Frederick, the Prince of Wales. He does have a son, so when Frederick dies early on, Frederick, the Prince of Wales, dies before his father does. That means the next in line to the throne is Frederick's son. Caroline and George have quite the marriage. You can see that they have, 8 children. But what's funny about them is they hated each other. They did not like each other at all. And eventually he actually has his wife essentially just banished at a certain point. He just had it with her, and so they do not have the fondest of marriage. But George II will die in 1760 and be replaced by his grandson. Now, the final king that will reign over what is now going to be the United States of America is King George III. George III will be king from 1760 to 1820. I believe he's third in the longest reigned monarchs of England and Great Britain. He was born in 1734. He was the son of Frederick, the Prince of Wales, and Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, the grandson of King George II. And his father dies just a few years before his grandfather does. And that means that the grandson will immediately succeed the grandfather instead of having the father succeed his grandfather and then him succeed him. Now, George III was a very young man when he became king. But something else about George III is he's going to be the first British king of the Hanoverian dynasty. He was the first one born in the United Kingdom. He's the first one that speaks English as his primary language. And so he really is the first of the Hanoverians who embraces Britishness. His consort is Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and you can see that they were quite busy. Two of his children, George IV and William IV, will be kings of the United Kingdom. One of his children, Ernst Augustus I, will become king of Hanover. And the reason why Hanover is separated from Great Britain is because with George IV dead, Frederick, Duke of York, dies. William IV, of course, succeeds his brother because the Duke of York dies before George IV does. And since boys come before girls, the next in line to the throne is Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent and Strathearn. Well, the problem with that, though, is that he is also dead, and his only heir is a child by the name of Alexandria. And so Hanover has a rule called Salic law, like the French do, where only men can inherit the throne. So instead of the daughter of the Duke of Kent and Strathearn, instead of her becoming the Queen of Hanover, her uncle Ernst Augustus becomes King Ernst Augustus I of Hanover. By the way, it's during George III's reign that Hanover is elevated to being a kingdom. Now, don't feel bad for Alexandria of Kent and Strathearn. She will do okay in her own right. As a matter of fact, she has even a TV show about her right now on BBC. Alexandria is, her name was actually Alexandria Victoria. When she succeeds her uncle, William IV, as Queen of Great Britain, she will take the title of Queen Victoria. So don't feel too bad for her. She does quite well. As a matter of fact, the entire age of the Hanoverians and her reign is called the Victorian era. So obviously she does quite well for herself. I could go on and talk about all the kings and queens of England and how interesting they are, but this is the last one that we need to talk about because this is the king during the American Revolution. This is that tyrant of England that will force himself, Great Britain that will force himself on the Americans. When we talk about the American Revolution, though, I'm going to dispel some of those myths, though. George III was a constitutional monarch, much like Queen Elizabeth II today of the United Kingdom. When we talk about the tyranny of Great Britain and the tyranny of the king, we have to remember that they're actually talking about something much different. They're talking about Parliament. So we'll talk about that when we get to the American Revolution.